The first time Tavia Monroe Whitlock saw her mother's sapphire ring behind auction glass, she did not scream, she did not faint, and she did not beg for it back. She simply stood beneath the golden chandeliers of Charleston's Hawthorne auction house and realized that some betrayals arrived dressed in white gloves and polite smiles. Good evening, my beautiful story family, wherever you are listening from tonight, whether you are in a quiet apartment after a long shift, sitting in your car under a streetlight, or lying awake when the rest of the house has gone silent. I hope this story finds the part of you that still believes dignity can survive even when love disappoints you. And if your heart feels heavy as you listen, maybe leave a few words about where you are and what brought you here, because sometimes a stranger's honesty in the comments becomes comfort for someone else who thought they were alone. The room around Tavia glittered with old Southern money, pearl earrings, tailored tuxedos, low laughter, and champagne flutes catching the light like small promises nobody intended to keep. Beyond the tall arched windows, Charleston Harbor lay dark and calm, the water reflecting the city lights in trembling gold. But inside the auction house, every breath felt measured, every glance expensive, every object on display carrying a story polished clean enough for wealthy hands to admire. Tavia had not come looking for pain that evening. She had come because a discreet email from an unknown sender had arrived 3 hours earlier with only one sentence. You should see lot 47 before the Whitlocks erased the name attached to it. At first, she thought it was some cruel mistake, another whisper from the world that had never fully welcomed her into the Whitlock family. But something in her chest tightened when she saw the attached photograph, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, resting in a velvet tray as if it had never once warmed against her skin. Now there it was, only 3 feet away, sealed beneath crystal-clear glass, labeled in elegant black lettering as the Whitlock Sapphire, a rare family heirloom from Savannah's oldest shipping dynasty. Tavia, read the card once. Then again. The words did not change, but something inside her did. That ring had never belonged to the Whitlocks. It had belonged to her mother, Celeste Monroe, a school nurse from Mobile, Alabama, who wore white sneakers to work, kept peppermint candies in her purse, and saved for almost 9 years to buy herself one beautiful thing after raising her daughter alone. On the morning of Tavia's wedding, Celeste had pressed the ring into her palm and whispered, "Baby, never let any house make you forget the home you came from." Tavia's fingers curled slowly around the empty space where the ring used to be. Around her, bidders murmured with interest, admiring the color, the setting, the supposed pedigree. They saw a jewel. Tavia saw her mother's hands. She saw Sunday sunlight on a kitchen table, a paper church fan, a blue dress carefully ironed for graduation, a woman who had given everything quietly and asked for nothing loudly. And then, from across the room, Tavia saw Callan Whitlock standing near the marble staircase, tall, pale, perfectly dressed in a navy suit that matched the family crest on the auction program. Her husband's face looked drained, but he did not move toward her. He did not stop the auctioneer. He only looked at her with the kind of sorrow that arrives too late to be useful. Tavia held his gaze for one long, silent second, and in that second, the music seemed to soften, the lights seemed to sharpen, and the truth became painfully clear. Someone in his family had taken the last gift her mother ever gave her, placed a new name over it, and offered it to strangers for money. And Callan, the man who had once promised to protect her heart, had known enough to be afraid, but not enough to be brave. 7 days earlier, the Whitlock dining room had looked almost too perfect to hold anything dishonest. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Savannah mansion, turning the garden beyond the glass into a blur of magnolia trees and silver light, while inside, the table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath a row of antique brass chandeliers. The china was hand-painted. The napkins were folded into sharp, white triangles. The silverware had been placed with military precision by staff members who moved so quietly they seemed like shadows. Tavia sat halfway down the table in a navy dress that made her caramel-brown skin glow beneath the candlelight, her posture straight, her voice calm, her mother's sapphire ring resting on her right hand like a small blue flame. Across from her, Callan's mother, Lenora Whitlock, lifted her wine glass and studied the ring with the same careful displeasure she used for chipped porcelain. "That is a striking piece, Tavia," Lenora said, her smile polished enough to fool anyone who had not lived under that roof. Very sentimental, I assume. Tavia touched the ring gently. It was my mother's. A silence passed around the table, thin as a blade and just as sharp. Callan's younger sister, Brielle, glanced at her husband with a little laugh hidden behind her water glass, while Callan's Uncle Mercer adjusted his cuff links and looked toward the portrait of a long-dead Whitlock hanging above the fireplace. No one said anything cruel outright. They never did. The Whitlocks believed cruelty was vulgar and less wrapped in etiquette. How sweet, Lenora replied. Some families pass down estates. Others pass down feeling. Callan's hand tightened around his fork, but he did not speak. Tavia noticed. She always noticed. For 3 years of marriage, she had learned the language of his silence, the way he lowered his eyes when his family crossed a line, the way he reached for her hand later in private, as if comfort offered after the wound could replace protection in the moment. He loved her. She knew that. But love that only breathed behind closed doors had begun to feel less like devotion and more like apology. The dinner had been arranged to discuss the upcoming anniversary gala for Whitlock Maritime, a celebration of 150 years of ships, warehouses, contracts, and a family named Savannah still treated like marble. Lenora spoke of donors, museum partnerships, guest lists, and legacy, while Tavia listened with the quiet patience of someone who understood that old families often feared truth more than failure. Near dessert, Mercer's voice dropped, and the staff was dismissed early. That was when the air changed. Words like bridge financing, private obligation, and temporary liquidity problem moved across the table in careful tones. Tavia did not interrupt, but she heard enough. The Whitlock name was not as steady as it looked. Behind the oil paintings and polished floors, something was cracking. Callan looked across the table at her then, and for 1 second, his gray-blue eyes carried a warning, not against danger, but against knowing too much. Tavia placed her hand over the sapphire ring, feeling the cool stone beneath her palm. She did not yet know they had already looked at it as an answer. She only knew that everyone at that table was protecting something, and for the first time, she wondered whether her place in that family had ever been real, or whether she had simply been tolerated because Callan loved her enough to bring her in, but not enough to make them let her belong. The morning after the dinner, Tavia woke before sunrise to the sound of gulls moving over the Savannah River and the low hum of rainwater dripping from the mansion gutters. The bedroom was quiet, washed in pale blue light, with Callan asleep on the far side of the bed, one arm folded beneath his head, his face softer in rest than it ever looked beneath his family's watchful eyes. For a moment, Tavia allowed herself to remember the man she had married, not the heir, not the chairman, not the silent son of a proud house, but the man who once drove 3 hours through a summer storm just to bring her soup when she had the flu, the man who learned her mother's favorite hymn so he could hum it beside Tavia on difficult days. That man was still there somewhere, but lately, she felt as if she was loving him through a locked door. She dressed quietly in a cream sweater and dark jeans, then crossed to the antique dresser where she kept her jewelry in a small walnut box her mother had found at a churchyard sale years ago. Tavia opened it with the gentle habit of someone touching memory, already reaching for the sapphire ring before her eyes understood what was missing. The velvet slot was empty. At first, her mind refused to accept the blank space. She lifted the thin gold chains, moved the pearl earrings, checked beneath the folded handkerchief scented faintly with lavender. Nothing. Her breath slowed, not from calm, but from the kind of shock that makes the body careful. She searched the dresser, the nightstand, the bathroom counter, the purse she had carried to dinner, even the pocket of the navy dress hanging neatly in the closet. The ring was gone. Behind her, Callan stirred. "Tavia," he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She turned, holding the open jewelry box in both hands. "My mother's ring is missing." He sat up too quickly. That was the first answer. Not surprise. Fear. The room seemed to narrow around them. The pale curtains, the polished floor, the family portraits on the wall, all of it suddenly watching. "Maybe it slipped somewhere," he said, but his eyes moved away from hers. Tavia closed the jewelry box with quiet precision. "Do not give me a soft lie before breakfast, Callan." His jaw tightened. Before he could answer, a knock came at the door, and Lenora entered without waiting, wrapped in a silk robe the color of winter smoke. She looked at the jewelry box, then at Tavia's face, and the absence of surprise in her expression said more than any confession could have. It was necessary, Lenora said. 3 words. Clean. Polite. Unforgivable. Tavia stood very still. Where is it? Lenora folded her hands at her waist, as if discussing table linens. A private broker in Charleston. The piece had value, and this family has obligations you could not possibly understand. Callan rose from the bed, but he did not step between them. Tavia noticed that too. That ring was my mother's, she said. Her voice did not rise, yet every syllable carried weight. It had her name before it ever entered this house. Lenora's mouth tightened. And this house gave you a name the world respects. The words settled like dust over fine furniture, covering everything, hiding nothing. Tavia looked at Callan then, not at his mother, because the wound had shifted. Did you know? Callan's silence entered the room before his answer did. He swallowed, and in that small movement, Tavia felt something inside her. Step backward, away from him, away from the mansion, away from every dinner where she had smiled to survive. I knew there were discussions, he said softly. I did not agree to this. Tavia's eyes shone, but no tears fell. No, she whispered. You only made room for it to happen. Outside, the rain stopped, and the first sunlight touched the river, bright and cold. Lenora looked almost relieved, as if the hardest part was over. But she did not understand. The loss of the ring was not the ending. It was the beginning of what happens when a woman finally learns the difference between being loved in private and being honored in public. By noon, the Whitlock mansion had returned to its usual performance of elegance, as if nothing sacred had been taken from a locked bedroom before breakfast. Fresh lilies stood in crystal vases along the hallway. A housekeeper polished the silver-framed photographs in the gallery. Somewhere downstairs, Lenora's voice floated through the air, calm and bright, discussing floral arrangements for the anniversary gala with the same woman who had signed away another woman's inheritance as if it were an old tablecloth. Tavia stood in the library with Callan, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books nobody seemed to read, while sunlight fell in long gold bars across the Persian rug. He had followed her there after his mother left, but he had brought no real answer with him, only regret arranged carefully behind tired eyes. I can get it back, he said at last. Tavia looked at him from beside the window. Can you? He stepped closer, his voice low. I will call the broker. I will pay whatever they ask. I will fix this. The word fix touched something tender and exhausted inside her. For 3 years, Callan had treated pain like a problem money could quietly remove before guests arrived. A cruel remark became flowers. A family insult became jewelry. A lonely holiday became a weekend at a resort on the Georgia coast. Each apology had been beautiful, expensive, and late. You think this is about the ring, Tavia said. Callan's shoulders dropped. It is not only about the ring. Then say what it is about. He opened his mouth, but silence returned first, familiar and polished, wearing his face like a mask. Tavia gave a small nod, as if his quiet had confirmed something she no longer needed to argue. It is about your mother believing my memories are less valuable than your family's reputation. It is about your sister laughing when I speak about where I come from. It is about your uncle calling me fortunate when he means acceptable. It is about every room where you loved me afterward, but left me alone during. Callan looked away toward the fireplace, where the Whitlock crest had been carved into dark wood more than a century ago. You do not understand what it is like to carry a name this old. Tavia's expression softened, but not with surrender. And you do not understand what it is like to enter a house where everyone keeps reminding you that your name arrived too late. The sentence settled between them, quiet and final. Outside, a tour boat moved along the Savannah River, its horn echoing faintly through the glass. For a moment, Callan seemed younger than his 36 years, less like a billionaire heir and more like a boy raised to obey portraits. I was trying to keep the family from falling apart, he said. And while you were holding them together, Tavia replied. Who was holding me? He had no answer. Downstairs, a door opened, and the distant sound of laughter rose from the foyer as guests began arriving for a planning luncheon. Tavia turned toward the sound, then back to her husband. She removed her wedding band slowly, not with anger, but with a steadiness that made the moment heavier than shouting ever could. The diamond caught the light once before she placed it on the library table between them. Callan stared at it, as if it had become impossible to breathe around. "Tavia, please." She picked up her purse and the small set of car keys beside it. "Do not ask me to stay in a house where my grief needs permission." His eyes lifted to hers, wet with words he still did not know how to speak. She waited one last second, not for apology, but for courage. When none came, she walked out of the library and through the long marble hallway, passing portraits, lilies, polished silver, and the smiling faces of guests who had no idea they were watching a woman leave with less than she had brought, but far more of herself than anyone in that mansion had ever allowed her to keep. By the time Tavia reached Charleston 7 days later, the city was shining as if it had never witnessed a dishonest thing in its life. The afternoon sun spilled across pastel houses and iron balconies, turning every window into a small square of fire, while horse-drawn carriages moved slowly over cobblestone streets and tourists lifted cameras toward buildings older than most family secrets. Tavia drove herself in a rented black sedan, both hands steady on the wheel, her cream coat folded neatly on the passenger seat, her wedding band still resting in a velvet pouch inside her purse. She had not returned to the Whitlock mansion after walking out. She had spent those days in a quiet hotel suite near Forsyth Park, answering no social calls, declining Lenora's carefully worded messages, and listening only once to Callan's voicemail before deleting it. His voice had been broken. Her resolve had not. Then the email came. Lot 47. A private auction. Charleston. For 3 hours, Tavia sat at the edge of the hotel bed with the photograph open on her phone, staring at the sapphire until memory and rage became something cooler, something sharper, something she could carry without letting it burn her hands. She booked the rental car before sunrise. Now, as she stepped into Hawthorne Auction House, the air smelled of polished wood, gardenias, and expensive perfume. Soft classical music drifted from hidden speakers, and everywhere she looked, people smiled in that careful way wealthy strangers smile when they are measuring one another. No one recognized her at first. That was the advantage of being underestimated for so long. A woman could move through rooms full of power unnoticed, and by the time anyone understood she had been listening, she already knew where the truth was hidden. Tavia accepted an auction paddle from the registration desk under her maiden name, Monroe, and the small act felt like breathing after years beneath water. The program in her hand was thick, embossed, and shameless. Antique silver, Civil War letters, a watercolor from a private Savannah collection. And then, on the center page, the sapphire ring photograph beneath museum lighting, described as a treasured Whitlock heirloom offered to support preservation efforts tied to the family's anniversary foundation. Tavia read the lie slowly, not because it surprised her, but because she wanted to remember every word. In the ballroom, the ring waited inside its glass case, deep blue and luminous, untouched by the false history printed beneath it. People leaned close to admire it. A woman in pearls said the color was divine. A man with a Charleston accent guessed it would clear $80,000 easily. Someone else whispered that the Whitlocks had always owned remarkable things. Tavia almost smiled at that. Some families did not own remarkable things. They simply stood close enough to them until the world forgot who brought the light. When the auctioneer finally approached the podium, his voice rolled through the room with practiced warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to Lot 47. An extraordinary sapphire and diamond ring connected to the distinguished Whitlock line of Savannah, Georgia." Tavia felt the room tilt toward the display case. Across the aisle, Callan appeared near the marble staircase, his face pale, his eyes locked on hers with a kind of helpless recognition. Lenora stood several feet behind him, dressed in ivory silk, her posture perfect, her expression only slightly strained. Brielle avoided Tavia's gaze entirely. That small avoidance told Tavia exactly who had touched the jewelry box. The bidding opened at $30,000. A paddle rose, then another. The numbers climbed with sickening grace, each bid turning her mother's sacrifice into entertainment for people who would forget it by dessert. 45,000, 50,000, 65,000. Tavia remained still until the auctioneer lifted his hand toward a bidder near the front row and said, $70,000. "Do I hear 75? Only then did she stand. The movement was quiet, but the room sensed it before the auctioneer did. Conversations thinned. Heads turned. Tavia did not look at Lenora. She did not look at Callan. She looked at the ring, then at the printed card beneath it. "Before anyone pays for that story," she said, her voice calm enough to carry, "they should know it is not true." The auctioneer blinked, smile faltering. "Ma'am, if there is a concern, our staff can assist you privately." Tavia stepped closer to the glass case. "There was nothing private about placing my mother's ring in this room under another family's name." A hush fell so complete that even the music seemed to disappear. Callan took one step forward, then stopped. Lenora's face tightened, but Tavia's voice stayed even, almost gentle, and that gentleness made the truth feel heavier. That sapphire belonged to Celeste Monroe of Mobile, Alabama. She was not a Whitlock. She did not own ships, mansions, or portraits in gold frames. She worked double shifts as a school nurse, saved for 9 years, and bought herself one beautiful thing because she believed a woman did not need permission to honor her own life. Tavia turned at last toward the room, her eyes bright but dry. That ring had a name before theirs touched it. No one spoke. The auctioneer lowered his papers. Lenora looked suddenly smaller beneath all that ivory silk. And Callan, standing beneath the marble staircase, looked as if every silence he had ever chosen had finally found its voice through the woman he failed to defend. The room did not erupt after Tavia spoke. It folded inward, quietly, the way old paper folds when the truth finally presses through it. A woman in the second row lowered her paddle into her lap. A man near the aisle removed his glasses and stared at the program as if the ink itself had betrayed him. The auctioneer leaned toward a staff member, whispering quickly, while the sapphire remained beneath the glass, still and blue, untouched by the shame gathering around it. Lenora Whitlock took one careful step forward, her ivory silk whispering against the polished floor. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice smooth enough for society pages, but not strong enough for the silence in that room. Tavia turned to her with a calm that did not need volume. "No, Mrs. Whitlock, a misunderstanding is when someone gets the wrong dinner reservation. This was a choice." The words landed without cruelty, which made them impossible to dismiss. Callan moved then, crossing the space between them with a pale, devastated expression, but Tavia lifted one hand, not to stop him harshly, only to ask for the distance he had given her when she needed his courage. He obeyed. That, at least, he finally understood. The auction was suspended within minutes. The ring was removed from public bidding, the staff apologizing in hushed tones as guests pretended not to stare. Tavia signed a statement for the auction house, provided photographs of her mother wearing the ring at a church banquet in Mobile, and forwarded a copy of the appraisal Celeste Monroe had kept folded inside an old Bible. Every document had her mother's name. Every date came before Tavia had ever met a Whitlock. By sunset, the story had already begun moving through Savannah and Charleston like summer heat. Not loudly at first. A canceled auction lot. A disputed heirloom. A prominent family asked to verify ownership. But power has a strange fear of paperwork, and by morning, the whispers had sharpened into headlines. Tavia did not give an interview. She did not need to. Truth, when handled with dignity, can travel without being chased. She returned to Savannah only to collect what belonged to her from the hotel suite, then drove west toward Atlanta with 2 suitcases, a folder of documents, and her maiden name restored on every reservation she made along the way. For weeks, Callan called. Sometimes he left messages. Sometimes he said nothing at all, and she would hear only his breathing before the voicemail ended. She saved none of them. It was not hatred that kept her from answering. It was healing. There is a difference. In Atlanta, she rented a small office on the 9th floor of a brick building near Peachtree Street, where the windows overlooked traffic, oak trees, and a city always rebuilding itself. The sign on the door read Monroe Reputation and Civic Trust. At first, there was only a second-hand desk, a laptop, 2 chairs, and a coffee maker that sounded like it was reconsidering life every morning. But Tavia knew how to build from quiet places. She had learned that from her mother. Her first client was a community clinic accused of misusing donations because of a careless accountant and a panicked board. Tavia reviewed every receipt, rebuilt public trust, arranged a transparent donor meeting, and saved the clinic without humiliating anyone who had made an honest mistake. Her second client was a scholarship foundation whose founder had died before correcting years of poor records. Her third was a small black-owned museum in Macon fighting to protect its grants after a developer tried to paint it as mismanaged. Tavia listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, people leaned closer. She never promised miracles. She promised truth with clean hands. 6 months became 9. 9 became 12. Her office grew from one room to a full suite with glass walls, soft gray furniture, and framed photographs of women who had built lives without applause. On the shelf behind her desk, she kept one empty velvet ring box, not as a wound, but as evidence. Some things stolen from you do not have to be returned before you rise. And while Tavia Monroe was building a name no one could borrow, the Whitlock name was beginning to crack beneath the weight of every secret it had tried to polish. The first public crack appeared on a Monday morning, not with shouting, not with scandalous photographs, but with a quiet resignation letter from the chief financial officer of Whitlock Maritime. By noon, 3 local business reporters in Savannah had confirmed that the company's anniversary foundation had delayed payments to vendors, shifted charitable funds between accounts, and quietly borrowed against restricted donations meant for coastal preservation projects. By evening, the city that once spoke the Whitlock name with admiration was speaking it with caution. Callan sat alone in the executive conference room on River Street, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of cargo ships moving slowly along the gray water. For most of his life, that view had meant certainty. Ships came in, contracts renewed. The family name opened doors before he even reached them. But now, every passing vessel looked like something leaving. Across the polished table, Mercer Whitlock spread folders in nervous stacks, while Brielle scrolled through her phone with trembling fingers, her diamond bracelet clicking softly against the screen. Lenora stood near the window in a charcoal suit, her spine straight, her face composed, but the powder beneath her eyes could not hide the exhaustion. "This will settle," she said. "Names like ours survive ugly weeks." Callan looked up slowly. "This is not an ugly week. This is a pattern." No one answered. That was how he knew. For years, the family had called their choices preservation. They had called their pride tradition. They had called their fear responsibility. Now the words had been stripped clean, and beneath them lay documents, transfers, donor complaints, and a ring that had revealed more than theft. It had revealed character. The board demanded an emergency meeting. Donors withdrew from the gala. The Savannah Historical Council postponed its tribute. Even the mayor's office released a careful statement about accountability, the kind of sentence that sounds polite until everyone understands it means distance. Callan spent 3 nights reading through records he should have questioned long ago. He found loans hidden behind foundation language. He found Mercer's signature on emergency transfers. He found Brielle's emails asking whether auctioning personal assets could be made to look charitable. And then, in one folder marked Temporary Solutions, he found a photograph of Tavia's sapphire ring attached to a note from Lenora. Sentimental value, high appraisal, minimal public risk. Minimal public risk. Callan stared at those 3 words until the letters blurred. Not because they were cruel, though they were. Because somewhere in his own silence, he had allowed his wife to become someone his family could calculate. The realization did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a locked door opening inside him, revealing every moment he had failed to walk through. He remembered Tavia at dinner, smiling through insult. Tavia in the library, asking who held her while he held them. Together, Tavia in Charleston, standing before strangers and speaking her mother's name into a room built to erase it. By the end of the week, Whitlock Maritime had lost 2 preservation contracts. A bank had frozen a credit extension, and more than 400 employees were being pulled into uncertainty because a powerful family had mistaken secrecy for strength. That was the part Tavia would have seen first, Callan thought. Not the mansion, not the crest, not the embarrassment. The workers, the warehouse clerks, the port supervisors, the bookkeepers who had given 30 years to a company now trembling because its owners had worshipped reputation more than truth. On Friday afternoon, Callan walked into the boardroom where his mother, uncle, and sister waited with attorneys. He placed the folder with Tavia's ring photograph in the center of the table. "We are going to Atlanta," he said. Lenora's eyes narrowed. "Absolutely not." "Yes," Callan replied, his voice calm in a way that surprised even him. We are. Mercer gave a strained laugh. To ask your wife to clean up a family matter after what happened? Callan looked at him then, and the room went still. She is not my cleanup crew. She is the only person I know who understands how to tell the truth without destroying everyone standing near it. Brielle's face paled. Lenora turned back toward the window, but this time her perfect posture looked less like pride and more like fear. She may refuse, Lenora said. Callan picked up the folder, holding it as if it weighed more than paper. She should. Outside, the river moved on beneath the late afternoon sun, carrying ships, secrets, and the old reflections of a city that had finally begun to look closer. And for the first time in his life, Callan Whitlock understood that saving a name did not begin with defending it. It began with admitting what had been done in its honor. Atlanta received the Whitlocks with glass towers, late afternoon traffic, and the kind of summer heat that made expensive suits feel honest. Tavia saw them before her assistant announced them, for figures standing beyond the frosted glass wall of Monroe reputation and civic trust like people, waiting outside a room they once believed beneath them. Callan stood in front, gray suit pressed, shoulders tense, one hand wrapped around a leather folder. Behind him, Lenora wore navy instead of ivory, a small surrender that only someone like Tavia would notice. Mercer looked older than he had in Savannah, and Brielle kept both hands clasped around her purse as if stillness could protect her from shame. Tavia did not rise when they entered. Her office was calm, sunlit, and quietly beautiful, with soft gray chairs, framed community awards, and a photograph of Celeste Monroe on the shelf behind her desk, smiling in a white nursing uniform, her sapphire ring bright on her hand. Lenora saw the photograph first. Her eyes moved to it, then away. "Thank you for seeing us," Callan said. His voice carried no entitlement now, only exhaustion. Tavia folded her hands on the desk. "I agreed to a meeting. That is all." The sentence was polite, but every person in the room understood its border. Callan nodded and placed the folder before her. "The company is in crisis. The foundation records are worse than I knew. Vendors are unpaid. Employees are frightened. The board is preparing to remove our family from leadership." Mercer shifted. "We need someone with credibility." Tavia looked at him calmly. "You need someone you did not damage." No one corrected her. That silence was different from the old ones. It did not hide contempt. It carried consequence. Lenora stepped forward then, slower than Tavia had ever seen her move. The woman who once filled rooms with certainty now seemed to measure each breath before spending it. "Mrs. Monroe," she began, then stopped, because the name itself was an admission. "Tavia, I was wrong." The words did not heal anything instantly. Real wounds rarely obey apologies on command, but they changed the temperature of the room. "I treated your history as if it were smaller than ours," Lenora continued, her voice thinner now. "I allowed fear to make me cruel, and I called it duty." Tavia studied her for a long moment. "You did not allow fear to make you cruel. You chose cruelty because it protected your comfort." Lenora's chin trembled once, almost imperceptibly. "Yes." Brielle looked down, tears gathering without drama. "I took the ring from the box," she whispered. "Mother told me it was temporary, but I knew it was yours. I knew." Callan closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he looked directly at Tavia. "I failed you before they did. I knew enough to stop it, and I chose delay because delay felt easier than confrontation. I am sorry for every room where I let you stand alone." Tavia felt the words enter her, not as rescue, not as romance, but as a truth arriving late and finally dressed correctly. She opened the folder and read in silence for several minutes. The facts were ugly, but not hopeless. The employees could be protected. The foundation could be audited. The donors could be told the truth. The family could lose pride and still save what mattered. At last, Tavia closed the folder. "I will take the case," she said. Relief moved through the room, but she lifted one finger before anyone could speak. "On 3 conditions. Full public disclosure, independent oversight for the foundation, and a scholarship fund in my mother's name, paid by your family personally, not the company, not the employees, not another borrowed account." Lenora nodded slowly. Mercer looked as if he wanted to object, but Callan spoke first. "Done." Tavia leaned back, her voice steady as evening light. "Then we begin with the truth. Not the version that preserves your name. The version that earns it back." The press conference took place 3 weeks later inside the Savannah History Museum, not in the Whitlock mansion, not beneath their portraits, and not on ground that belonged only to them. Tavia chose the museum because truth deserved a public room, clean light, and witnesses. Reporters filled the rows of folding chairs. Employees from Whitlock Maritime stood along the side walls. Donors, city officials, and community leaders waited beneath banners celebrating the coastal families, dock workers, teachers, nurses, and builders who had shaped Savannah far beyond any single last name. Callan spoke first. His voice did not shake, but it had lost the polished armor Tavia once knew. He admitted the foundation's failures, named the improper transfers, announced independent oversight, and accepted that leadership without accountability was only inheritance wearing a suit. Lenora spoke next. She apologized to the employees, to the donors, and to Tavia, not with elegance, but with humility. Then she announced the Celeste Monroe Scholarship for students entering nursing and public health across Georgia and Alabama, funded personally by the Whitlock family for the next 25 years. When Tavia stepped to the microphone, the room became still. She wore a simple cream dress, no diamonds, no borrowed symbols. Only her mother's sapphire ring restored to her hand after the auction house returned it with a formal apology. "A name is not saved by hiding the truth," she said. "A name is saved when the people carrying it become brave enough to deserve it." No one applauded at first. The sentence needed space. Then one employee began clapping, and slowly, the room followed. Afterward, Callan found Tavia near the museum steps, where late sunlight touched the brick sidewalk, and the air smelled faintly of river salt. "I know I cannot ask you to come back," he said. Tavia looked at him gently. "Then do not." He nodded, accepting the mercy inside the boundary. His eyes moved to the ring. "It looks right on your hand." Tavia smiled softly, not for him, but for the woman who had saved 9 years for one blue stone and called it joy. "It was never proof that I belonged to your family," she said. "It was proof that I belonged to myself." Then she walked down the museum steps into the warm Savannah evening, not as a wife returned, not as a woman repaired by apology, but as Tavia Monroe, carrying her mother's name, her own grace, and a future no one would ever label for her again. In the end, Tavia did not choose revenge, and she did not choose to return to a place that only valued her after it needed her. She chose her mother's name, her own peace, and a future with clean air around it. If you were standing on those museum steps, with an apology behind you and your dignity finally back in your hands, would you forgive and stay, or forgive and walk away? Share what your heart would have done.